The trial against Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin has thrown America's racial divide into the spotlight once more. Let's get some analysis with Mark Watson. He's founder and principal consultant at Sydney Avenue Consultants, also leading national security advisor at Bondi Partners and a former security advisor at the embassy, the Australian Embassy in Washington, DC. You've watched the US for many years, both from there and from here. What's your sense of the history that we're seeing really on show right now in Minneapolis in terms of the historical legacy of racial divide there?
I think what we're seeing right now with the Black Lives Matter movement in general, and this of course is just one narrow flashpoint in that movement, it really goes back to the very earliest days of the United States. In fact, before there was a United States, when the first enslaved peoples arrived in America in 1619, fast forward through to the War of Independence and that great document, the Declaration of Independence. You don't need to be a student of American history to have some of these words rumbling around. You know, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that they've been endowed with certain unalienable rights by the Creator, among those life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, the irony was that document was crafted by Thomas Jefferson, who owned 600 slaves. And that fundamental inability to reconcile, on the one hand, the treatment of African Americans with the fine words and ideals of the great United States experiment lies at the heart of this. And it runs through the Constitution, which enabled a lot of slave-owning laws to continue, through obviously the Civil War, through to segregationalist policies from the late 1890s through really right through until the 1960s, where that great civil rights movement came up. Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, and the Civil Rights Act itself. Now we're seeing another iteration, and I think what links those things together, when the pressure for change to address inequality and inequity, the pressure exceeds the ability of US society to accommodate that, or a willingness of US society to accommodate that, you get these great rifts, like shifts in tectonic plates and a great release of pressure. The Civil War, the Civil Rights Movement, and now the Black Lives Matter movement. I think they're all on a continuum of a great unresolved issue in American society.
And the Black Lives Matter movement, as you said earlier, the flashpoint was the death of George Floyd. And while this is another and new iteration of that racial divide that you eloquently captured there over centuries, there are similarities, aren't there, in recent decades to what we're seeing now in terms of a court case, a black man killed by the police, so much at stake.
Yeah, absolutely. This is almost the latest, I hesitate to say battleground, but that's almost what it is, point of conflict, if you will, between the organs of the state and a community that feels it is living with this historical legacy of inequity and inequality and an inability of US society to accommodate their legitimate claims in those regards. And so the relation between police and community here is at the core of this issue. And again, it is just one of those unresolved issues that goes back, nearly 500 years.
And we saw what happens, when the outcome is not as many would want it in the court, and then there are riots and there are more fatalities that sadly, tragically, seem inevitable if,
we have seen that
if this is not guilty.
Absolutely. From the 1980s, the 1990s, in the 1960s, Washington, DC itself was ablaze. Right near where the Australian Embassy is in Washington was in flames, just 2 streets over. So the depth of feeling and the violence that can erupt, as I say, when you get that great release of pressure in times like this, it almost inevitably leads to some form of violence. Quite concerning is the calls outside the courtroom by supporters of the victim in this case, and that is the call for the jury to do their duty and convict. Well, that is not the duty of the jury. The duty of the jury is to consider the facts and reach an impartial decision. So if you're starting from there, any decision that goes against that is going to be very difficult to accept.
The issue of racism and the presence of racism, often the idea is that it's from emanates from the South in the United States. But when we look at Minnesota, Minneapolis, where this trial is, it's at the very north of the US, on the Canadian border.
Yeah, look, the issues that are dealt with by the African American community across all social indicators, education, health, longevity, wealth. There's a whole host of social indicators that they consistently perform poorly, and I don't believe that is completely geographically bound. I think they're the common issues, whether you're in a city in New York, in Detroit or Los Angeles. Some of those issues continue to ferment just beneath the surface.
Back home now, that reshuffle yesterday from the Prime Minister with the surprise move, I think one that caught many by surprise was Karen Andrews moves to Home Affairs as someone who's worked in security and that part of government for many, many years. Would you think now that the Secretary, Mike Pizzullo, stays there at Home Affairs to help the new minister usher in, as opposed to moving, say, with Peter Dutton to Defence, who he's got a close working relationship with?
You would think in the short term at least, so 6 months plus, you would leave your secretaries in place normally, rather than have a minister and a secretary both change position at the same time. That could be very difficult for people in the department to have maintained continuity. The problem is that the Secretary of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, Francis Adamson, is due to retire or to move on to something else mid-year. And people have been looking, well, who will take the foreign affairs portfolio? And some of the names that people are looking at come out of the portfolios where ministers have shifted. So I think the Prime Minister is going to have to do a little bit of a jigsaw work on this one.
Mark Watson, as always, thanks for your analysis. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Kevin.